All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA AFRICOM Indo-PACOM speaker session entitled, What is the Real Story of China and Africa? I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Deborah Brautigam, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions to Mariah Yeager today. She'll be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager. Questions that are not submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send your questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address your question. Go ahead and if you'd prefer for your name to not be recorded, rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Deborah Brautigam is a Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of Political Economy and the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Her recent books include The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China and Africa, and Will Africa Feed China? Her teaching and research more broadly focus on international development strategies, governance, and foreign aid. So without any further ado, Dr. Brautigam, I will turn the floor over to you, and I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm delighted to be here, and I will start sharing my slides. All right, so it looks like everything's up there. So my talk today is called, What is the Real Story of China and Africa? And it's when I was originally approached to give this talk, it was by one of your colleagues who had read my book, The Dragon's Gift, and wondered what I thought about The Dragon's Gift now and the things that I had argued there. And so it provoked me to go back and reflect a little bit about that. And I'm not going to, and that really could take hours. So I'm not going to go through all of that. But what I will do is tell you a little bit about what the real story is, the way I see it today.
Sometimes you'll need to click on the slides to be able to proceed.
I see, there you go. Thanks. So the takeaways, to just tell you the conclusions right at the start, are that when it comes to China and Africa, evidence-based analysis trumps media headlines. And second, China's own experience as a developing country is really important in understanding how China approaches Africa. And within this, China sees development as structural transformation. That means moving up the value chain from raw material exports to finished products, from agriculture to industry and then services. And they see this in Africa as how Africa should be moving forward as well in order to develop. And secondly, China learned from Japan and others as it was moving up its own development experience. And finally, that China's engagement in Africa really is a learning process. As Bo Xilai, one of the Chinese politicians who's now in prison, said, it's crossing the ocean by feeling the stones. So I started looking at China and Africa quite a long time ago. This is, you probably can't recognize me there from the back, but this is a picture of me in 1984 in Liberia, where I was doing research on Chinese aid projects. And here's another one there. I'm circled so you can see who I am. So I've been looking at this topic for quite a long time. And in 2006, after I had written one book on this, which sank like a stone, that this idea that China was a threat really was pervading the media. You can see down here different studies, talks, cartoons were all about China's threatening engagement in Africa. And that didn't really accord with how I had seen it. You know, I've been looking since 1983, actually. I'd written a book on it, and I had done a lot of research since then, and I had a different perspective. So my first PhD research came out as a book, Chinese Aid in African Development. And then the research that I started in 2006 came out as The Dragon's Gift, the real story of China and Africa. That's to give you a little bit of background. And when I was introducing The Dragon's Gift, I often used the story, which I think tells a lot about how the Chinese view their engagement there. And it begins once upon a time. So I'll give that to you today too. Once upon a time, there was a large, very poor, but resource-rich country that was just emerging from a period of intense conflict. And they decided to focus on development. But they had no money, really, they weren't creditworthy, they couldn't borrow internationally. And very soon they had a visit from a wealthy Asian country that had already become a major consumer of one of their big exports, which was oil. And this wealthy Asian country said to them, "We can help you. We'll give you a line of credit worth $10 billion. And you can use that to have our companies develop your ports and your mines and your power plants and all of the infrastructure that you need to move forward. And you can repay us with the oil that you're already exporting, and that can secure the loan." And many within this poor country were very concerned about this relationship, and they were not sure whether they should move forward, but they did. And the rest is history. So when you hear this story, you may be wondering which countries I'm talking about. And if you know anything about my research, you probably know. And people often think, well, was it Angola, or was it Sudan or Nigeria? And clearly one of the countries is China. But the surprise in this story is that it was the large, poor, resource-rich country that was China. China, and the time was 1978. And China was just emerging from a period of intense conflict, the Cultural Revolution. And it was Japan that approached them with this deal. And so the rest is history. This deal helped launch China on its own success story. And this is how the Chinese look at their engagement in Africa as offering this kind of potential for structural transformation. So Chinese engagement has costs and benefits. And there are a lot of real concerns. And I know over at DOD, you've been focusing on a lot of those. But let me give you my perspective here. So in 2006, what we were in the West really concerned about was that China was going to grab all of the resources, the natural resources in Africa. We were concerned, for example, the slide on the left is China and Sudan, where they had developed the oil industry. And we were concerned that China was going to be engaging only with resource-rich countries and propping up dictators. And those were our major concerns. So in the years since then, research has been done, and I'll give you the example of mining over on the other side of the slide. And this comes from a study that was published in 2019 by researchers based in the UK. So what they show here, and I think it's quite interesting, is the distribution of gold, copper, and diamond mines around Africa. And all of the little blue, or the sort of blue triangles, are mines that are not controlled by the Chinese. So you can see it's overwhelmingly not Chinese. And then the little yellow diamonds are mines that are Chinese controlled. So this was published in 2019 and the data is fairly recent. And it shows that Chinese control of mines is actually much smaller than we think when we think about the Chinese locking up all of these resources. And nobody actually has done this kind of analysis for oil. And it's kind of interesting that it takes a lot of work, and that analysis still awaits a researcher to do it. So African concerns are plentiful about what the Chinese are doing. They're concerned about Chinese imports wiping out their industries. They're concerned about Chinese illegal fishing, wiping out their fisheries. They're concerned about illegal forestry exports and timber exports. And I think something that's been in the media quite a bit recently is labor relations. And they're concerned about the way that Chinese businesses and Chinese contractors, Chinese mine operators, construction firms, how they often treat their African workers. And it's a myth, by the way, that they bring in all their own Chinese workers. They're hiring Africans, but they don't always treat them very well. And all of these are real concerns and have helped to sully China's reputation on the continent. Yet, even with all of this, public opinion in Africa continues to be positive about China. So why is that? And I'll show you the data on this. This is Afrobarometer, which is run out of the Michigan State University. And it shows perceptions in this particular instance. They do public opinion research across the continent, and they're regarded as the most reliable source in the largest number of countries. And within their data, in 2014, 2015, China was seen as a somewhat or very positive influence in their country, 63%, which was the average for all the countries. And you can see it varies around the continent, but it was positive. And then we can see this even continuing in their most recent data, which shows that 59% of the people in the survey just a year or so ago saw China positively. And this was a little bit higher than us in 58%. So what's going on there? Let's look a little deeper. What are China's goals in Africa? And some of this is going to compare what China's doing in Africa a little bit with what the United States is doing in Africa. So strategic diplomacy is really important for the Chinese. There are 54 countries in Africa, and they all have a vote at the United Nations. So issues like the Uyghurs, the Chinese try to counter what they see as a mistaken view of the Uyghurs, but they try to counter this, what they regard as an internal issue, through their strategic diplomacy. And all of those 54 countries, if they could line up with the Chinese at places like the United Nations, that matters. Taiwan is a perennial issue for the Chinese. The Dalai Lama in Tibet, the South China Sea. So all of these aspects of strategic diplomacy are important. And so the Chinese pay a lot of attention to Africa. For example, since 1990, the first visit of the Chinese foreign minister every year has been to Africa. And they visit African countries, usually 3 of them. And this has been going on and on and on. So they're paying a lot of attention, and it's not just lip service, they're actually going there. And this is from the Dragon's Gift. I haven't updated this, but it shows the visits to Africa from 1995 to 2009 of Chinese presidents and premiers. And I can tell you this is a whole lot more than the United States has been doing. We're really not very engaged. So business is also extremely important. And there are 2 pictures here. I took both of these pictures during field research. On the right-hand side, you can see different airlines. I took this in Mauritius, where I was actually doing research, not having a vacation. But I think it's interesting because you have British Airways up there at the top, and then you have Cathay Pacific and Dragonair and Air Madagascar. And it shows the changing nature of what's going on in Africa. It's not just the old colonial system anymore with the old British and French. It's now got new players going on. And then on the other side, it's a picture I took when I was doing research for my latest book, but we just happened to pass a Chinese road crew that was building a road in Tanzania. This is up country. And you can see there's just one Chinese supervisor down there, and the rest of the workers are African. And you can also see they don't seem to have protective clothing. Some of them are barefoot. And that goes along with some of the concerns about how the Chinese engage. But construction is huge. And this is often not well understood, but what this slide shows is the revenues from Chinese infrastructure contracts in Africa. And it's now averaging around $50 billion. And as you can see, this has continued. It peaked in 2015, and it's been slowly going down, but it's still quite high. And as you'll see in a minute, this is not all supported by Chinese loans by any means. These are Chinese companies getting contracts from a number of different funders, and including African governments themselves from their own revenues. So it's a big business, over $50 billion a year. That's really a lot of money, and it's a lot more revenue than they're getting from natural resource projects. So the African Development Bank estimates that the infrastructure gap in Africa is 130 to 170 billion per year. That's what's not being paid for. And what the Chinese are doing is not included in that. So they're filling part of the gap, but they're filling part of the need, but there's still a remaining gap. And the slide here is from Liberia after the Civil War. So what about foreign direct investment? As you can see, the Chinese compared to the US, we've actually been leaving Africa. So the blue line there is the US. We peaked in 2009, and then we've been leaving. So right now, our net investment is negative. That means that there is more money coming out of Africa than is going in from the United States in terms of equity purchases. For the Chinese is not the case. Theirs is still, I think, not as high as a lot of people realize. And this data may not reflect capital coming in from offshore accounts, neither for the United States nor for China. But it does show that the Chinese engagement continues to increase when ours is leaving. And then if we look at trade, when I first wrote The Dragon's Gift, and I was researching from 2005, 2009, our trade and Chinese trade were pretty even. They were both going up. And then ours plateaued and sank. And that's because of partly the price of natural resources, which is most of our trade with Africa, just like China's trade is mostly natural resources. But we've really plateaued and we're just not that present. Whereas the Chinese they dip down, but they're continuing to go up. And then, of course, there's security. And since you are DOD and people related to DOD, I don't need to say very much about this, and it's not really my area. But the Chinese now have their first overseas military base. That is, if you don't regard the South China Sea as overseas, certainly there are Chinese military installations there as well. But in the Chinese view, it's their first overseas military base, and that's also of interest. So what we do at the China-Africa Research Initiative is evidence-based research. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of our research projects. And I think they're interesting because they show a little bit about how we do research. And we look at what's out there for our hypotheses. We look at a lot of headlines. So what do people think the Chinese are actually doing? And then I kind of sift through that in order to pick topics that I think are interesting based on my own longstanding knowledge of what the Chinese are probably doing or actually doing. And then I dig into it in more detail. And we've called our research method forensic internet sleuthing for the start. So we look on the internet to find out about things, but then we follow it up with field research and case study based research or analytical narratives in which we trace the process of different projects. How did they actually happen? So the first one that I want to tell you about is it's actually my latest book, and it related to this concern that the Chinese were leading the land grab in Africa. And so about 2008, 2009, just as The Dragon's Gift had been published, there were headlines around the world, and this just is a particularly good one from the Hindustan Times. India joins race for land in Africa, China way ahead. And there were a number of different projects listed in this newspaper article. And this was also it was in the Financial Times, The Economist, and other very well respected global newspapers that the Chinese were grabbing up all this land in Africa. And so since my first research project had been about Chinese agricultural engagement in my first book, I thought this would be a really interesting thing to research. And I had a sabbatical, which I was spending at the International Food Policy Research Institute here in Washington. And so I used part of that sabbatical to start this new research. And what I did was, together with my research assistant there, we put together a list of all of the cases that we saw anywhere in the media about land grabs that the Chinese were allegedly doing in Africa. And the idea was that they were grabbing all this land, they were going to grow food, use it to grow food to send home to China, and they were going to bring in Chinese workers to do it. So that was the basic hypothesis that we were looking to explore. And so we looked at all these, we had at least 22 cases, there was a lot. So some of this was collected in an online database called the Land Matrix that had looked at media reports. And these were all different media reports about what the Chinese were doing. And so to make we spent 3 years with a whole group of researchers, and I moved to Johns Hopkins University after IFPRI. And so I had my sci students doing research with me in the field, and a lot of different visits to most of these countries here. And so what we found was that actually out of all of those cases, those 22 cases, there are only 4 that actually happen. And so this research is explained in more detail, of course, in my book, my latest one, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And it tells what actually happened. And I think that's the interesting part of any of this research on China and Africa. It's not just laying out the data there. It's going into the field to explore, well, the Chinese were interested. Chinese companies were interested. Why didn't they invest? And so if you want to hear that story, you'll have to invite me back to get a more detailed explanation. But my bottom line conclusion was that Africa was not going to be feeding China anytime soon. And interestingly, the data showed that China was actually feeding Africa. If you looked at exports of Chinese goods to Africa or agricultural products from Africa to China, it was China that was sending food to Africa. And that's not surprising because, as those of you who know something about Africa know, it's a food deficit region. Africa has been importing, by and large, food from other parts of the world for a long time. And that hasn't changed with the Chinese engagement. So it's now China that they're importing food from. So the second project that we undertook at CARI, at the China-Africa Research Initiative, was based on this is a book project that's ongoing right now. What is China's role in Africa's debt problem? So after I published the last book, that seemed to be the issue, that countries were starting to borrow more and more from China. We could see this because we had a database. And so I'll let you show this to you a little bit. This database is available online. It's something that we run together with Boston University now, so they are hosting the database. But we developed it at SAIS at Hopkins, and it's a fascinating database. You can go there, and I'll give you the URL. But we've got loans all around Africa, and $153 billion that we've tracked from 2000 to 2019, and 1,141 loans. And as you can see from this slide, it's been going up since 2000 with a peak in 2016, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But it's going into sectors that really relate to structural transformation. So it's transport and power. And then we'll look at mining. Mining is largely to Angola, and it's to Angola's state-owned oil company, Sonangol. So it throws the data off a little bit. But it's really about the kind of infrastructure that African countries need in order to move forward with their development goals, just as China moved forward with its development goals with funding from Japan back in the 1970s. So if we look at this, we'll use the case of Zambia because I've just finished a paper on Zambia, so it's fresh in my mind. So you hover, if we had this live, you hover over the country and it pops up with this other information. So we have 9.9 billion that the Chinese have committed in Zambia, and 72 loans in those different sectors again. And then the data also shows all of the different projects that you can, that we've tracked. This is just a snapshot of that. But what's interesting here is that you can see in terms of the creditors that, there are a number of different lenders here. So we have China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, Polytechnologies, which is a military company, and lots of different lenders. We have different borrowers, only the government and their state-owned enterprises, but there are different entities signing these loans. And that information is all available on our database. So what does that look like if we're looking at the distribution across the continent? Well, this is Chinese loan commitments. And as you can see, they do peak in 2016, but this is thrown off by Angola. So Angola is about 30% of China's lending across Africa. It's huge. And in 2016, it was particularly large. And some of this related to refinancing. So in our data, refinancing a new $10 billion loan coming in from China Development Bank, since we only look at commitments, we have to include that, even though it was going back to China to repay old loans. So the net value for 2016 would be a lot lower, but we're using gross values for all of the years. And so we do for that year too. But if you take Angola out of the data and just look at the blue, which is all other countries, you can see that Chinese lending peaked in 2013, which interestingly was the first year of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then it's been stable or declining from then on. So we were interested in debt, so Chinese lending in debt-distressed countries. And what this shows is, let's see, this is the Africa data, and I think these are mainly the low and low middle income countries in Africa. And what was interesting when I put this out in a scatter plot was that we have external debt to GDP ratio along the y-axis, and then commitments from our database as a percent of total external debt along the x-axis. And what it shows is that 4 countries really stand out here: Djibouti, the Republic of Congo, Angola, and then Zambia. And so Zambia I decided to focus in on Zambia because that was the most interesting of these 4 cases from my perspective. And I could talk about that more in the Q&A. But out of this, we also realized that Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Kenya were also countries that had borrowed more than 25% of their loan commitments were more than 25% of the total external debt. And so we figured those countries were also going to have trouble. And that is what we've seen up to the present. So we also did research, and we spent a year doing this, preparing to go into the field, which was stopped because of COVID. But our background research looked at 17 African debt restructuring cases, and we found a variety of different kinds of results. So the Chinese had done a lot of debt restructuring already from 2000 to 2019. And these were kind of ad hoc cases when countries got into trouble. They went to their Chinese lenders, they got maturity extensions, et cetera, et cetera. And none of these, by the way, include the interest-free loan cancellations, which are a Chinese foreign aid tool, which are treated separately. And so this research allowed me to write, for example, an article that came out not long ago in The Atlantic with Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School. She covers Chinese engagement in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port example. And then I added my research from Africa. And we wrote a provocative piece in The Atlantic about the Chinese debt trap is a myth. So you can click on that later on if you're interested to read the analysis there. So I think the takeaways, I'll just wind up here, that evidence-based analysis trumps media headlines. I hope I've shown a little bit about how we approach that at the China-Africa Research Initiative and how I've approached it as a researcher. Fieldwork is really important. Develop hypotheses from the newspapers, but don't take those as the gospel truth. And second, China's own experience as a developing country really does matter. The nature of their engagement, the emphasis on infrastructure from the Chinese point of view, it's a mutual benefit situation. Their companies get the contracts. There are problems with corruption, to be sure, which China has a lot of at home as well. But the African borrowers are getting real assets at the end. These are public assets. Instead of this money is not going to consumption. And so that's a real difference in terms of debt sustainability. And then finally, that it's a learning process. And I haven't talked very much about this, but very much the Chinese are continually changing, upgrading the way they're operating, responding to African concerns. And it's not static by any means. And I think if we don't continue to upgrade our own understanding, we're going to fall behind. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. Let me adjust the screen view real quick. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's discussion. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through the Q&A chat. All right, we have quite a few to begin with. So let us go with this question from Larry Cook to begin with. So Larry asks if your data suggests any success stories in Africa that may be analogous to the success that China has seen over the past 30 years.
That's a great question, Larry. The short answer is no. And the reason for that is that the determinants of Chinese engagement in Africa are really determined by Africa. They're determined by African governments and the degree to which they take advantage of what China's offering in this engagement. And again, to relate that to China and Japan, when Japan was engaging with China, they were engaging with a country that had a leadership that was very focused on economic development, not growth alone, but structural transformation. China wanted to learn from Japan. They wanted to learn everything they could from Japan. They wanted to send their experts to Japan and really follow Japan's example and climb up the value chain as fast as they could. There are very few countries in Africa that have that kind of government. There are a couple of examples. Rwanda's one, and Ethiopia. And then Ethiopia has changed its leadership several times recently after the death of Meles Zenawi. I think if Meles Zenawi had lived, we might have seen a different case of Ethiopia with a developmental leadership. But that's really been the hugely the exception rather than the rule. So, unfortunately. And, you know, of course, there are smaller examples. We can look at different, even in Ethiopia, manufacturing zones, which have been fairly successful. There are other examples of, you know, even in Niger, say, a petroleum refinery that the Nigerians have now, so they don't have to import all their refined petroleum from abroad. So there are some small examples, but by and large, I would say, you know, it's really determined by Africans themselves, and they haven't done it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. Our next question is from Maral Karan. And this question is, can you comment on what due diligence and risk analysis China does regarding their lending? I'm curious if China is at risk of overextending their lending as having countries default as Zambia has recently.
Yes, well, that's a much longer question. I would say that it's, again, it shows how China is learning and changing. So in the early years, when I was looking at, say, from 2006 onward, the Chinese really talked about development sustainability rather than debt sustainability. And their whole view was that the IMF's perspective on debt sustainability was too narrow. That it just focused on the amount of debt and not what the debt was being used for. So the Chinese would say, for example, if you're building roads and you're building power plants and you're building export zones, you're going to be building the economy for the future, and it's going to make the economy better able to repay loans. So that would be their perspective. And due diligence, I think, again, they've been learning about this. Sinosure, the export credit agency, was only set up, it's been about almost 20 years now. But that's a pretty short time in terms of really learning how to do this. And most of the lending was taking place during a pretty positive period as Africa was coming out of debt and growth was happening. And we were all looking at Africa as like, wow, you know, this is the African decade, or maybe even the African century. And the Chinese were looking at it like that too. So they had they were blinded by, what do we call it? Rose-colored glasses. I'm forgetting how that actually goes. But they were wearing their blinders just the way we were in much earlier on in the West when we overlent to Africa. So the risk analysis is being done, it's constantly being refined. And as we could see from the fact that lending went down from 2013 onward, except for the case of Angola, which is partly refinancing, the Chinese lenders have been responding to the increased risk environment that has come out of the collapse of commodity prices. And so in the aggregate, you can see that happening, and you can see it on the individual level with the, for example, Sinosure has to insure these loans, and they are the one that is taking the hit now in these default situations. And so they are holding back on insuring new loans, and we can see this happening in our data. and in individual cases. In due diligence, I think if you're talking just about risk, that's one aspect that I've addressed, but there's a lot more to due diligence, which is in terms of social and environmental sustainability. And again, here, Chinese lending has improved. It's still nowhere at the level of the lending that OECD countries do or the World Bank does. And many in Africa would argue, would appreciate that the West does a lot more due diligence, but what that has meant is that we pretty much stopped funding infrastructure because it's so hard to get infrastructure to, it's a sector with a lot of corruption. And so we pulled away from it because of governance concerns and also because of environmental concerns. So we just stopped funding it rather than try to do it in an improved way. And that's been unfortunate.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from SMA's director, Todd Beasy. And the question is, can you comment about the transparency of these loans and contracts between China and these African countries? Reports that I've read suggest that these are opaque and secretive, but is that what you've seen?
Yeah, I'd have to agree that they are opaque and secretive. And on in the Dragon's Gift, when I was just rereading the introduction, it's one of the things that that I wrote about there in that book, that China is very secretive about its overseas finance. It's been, foreign aid was a state secret, as officially they could not talk about it. And it's for politics. So they've done this for a long time. And it's also actually the standard for commercial bank lending, which the Chinese loans have moved much more in that direction since 2006, is secrecy. So international banking, like we know from the case of Switzerland, it's a very secretive kind of business. And so transparency is not the norm in international lending. So the study that you are referring to used 100 Chinese loan contracts, and they compared that, and these were around the world, and they did show that there was a high degree of untransparency. But what they also showed was, and they didn't really highlight this in their conclusions, but that this lack of transparency also applied to commercial lending from other lenders. And it even applied to the French. The loans from the French aid agency had equivalent non-disclosure requirements in the loan. So I think one needs to really read that study carefully. And even as I've done, look at all their data, which is available online. Hardly anyone actually looks at that. They just look at the spin that the media has put on that and the researchers themselves. So it's a great study and a great resource for us to examine these contracts further, and I've learned a lot from it. But they're not unique in that lack of transparency. And I think, let me just say one further thing about that, which is that we've had one of the papers that I still haven't written, or really a public square piece, will be called "China is not a donor." We have this idea that the Chinese, that we're comparing like China with the World Bank or China with USAID, and they're not the same. They're much more like our Exim Bank, but they're also like commercial banks around the world. And that's, so we've seen this playing out during the debt crisis, that the Chinese, and getting to know how it works better, I think can help us understand what our expectations should be of the Chinese and how we should have the same kinds of expectations of them and of our own lenders, like the bond traders. And the commercial banks coming from Europe and the US that are also involved in the debt crisis. So we should be comparing apples with apples, in other words.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. So we've had a flood of questions, so I'm going to do my best to not hop around too much, but I'm having to scroll through all the questions to get to one that neatly follows the previous question. So thank you everyone for asking your questions. But that said, I may be hopping around a little bit. So I have seen a few questions on this topic. So I will bring up a question that we received at the beginning from Todd Beasy, and I'll combine that with a question that we received from Barry Brewer. So this first question is, are you aware of anyone that is applying similar research methodologies to other continents? For example, are you aware of Chinese activities in South America, and does it follow a similar pattern to what you've described in Africa? And Barry brought up specifically about see if you were seeing a shift from Africa to South America in Chinese investments.
Oh, yeah, thanks for that question, because I can highlight the work that Boston University has been doing. So the reason we decided to move our loan database and join forces with Boston University and the work of the Development Policy Center run by Kevin Gallagher is that their methodology and their approach is very similar to ours. And they had done what we were doing in Africa, they did in Latin America except they only focused on Chinese policy banks, the China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, and they haven't collected data on other lenders. But Kevin Gallagher's work has been, he's a Latin America specialist, and he's developed a China expertise out of that, which is kind of the opposite of what I did. I started as a China expert, and then I developed an Africa expertise, but it's complementary. So the research that Kevin Gallagher's been doing and his team is really, it's very similar to us. They have a lot of data, the data is really good, and then they do a lot of field work, and they're very concerned with the environment. So and social standards. So they have really good research on that. I think there are other groups out there. The Natural Resources Governance Institute is doing a lot of research on resource secured lending. They haven't done as much field work. Global Witness, wonderful for field work, although they don't have the data. Then there's like William and Mary, they have this China aid database. They don't do field work, but they have data which is increasingly it's better and better as the years go on. I think their methodology has improved a lot. And then in Asia, there's Naohiro Katano in Japan, he's been doing research on Chinese engagement in Asia. So just in terms of data, those are some of the researchers that I would point to. In terms of doing, the kind of overall, like what I did with the Dragon's Gift, I haven't really seen somebody doing that quite like that, but there are some people. Carol Wise has done a really good analysis of Chinese engagement in Latin America from the Latin American perspective, looking to see why some countries benefited from Chinese engagement and some didn't. And so that's a really interesting empirical study that she published with Yale University Press recently. So there are a number out there, and I'd be happy to I guess I can't put it into the chat because I have to answer more questions, but if people are interested, I can provide links on. And these are all people that are focused on development. So, because that's the research that we do. We're not looking at the security angle so much, but they're related.
Right, thank you.
There was another part to that question, which was has Latin America, what was it? Has Latin America taken what was the part about Latin America taken over from China, or is like shifting or something like that?
Yeah, if you were aware of Chinese activities in South America, and does it follow a similar pattern to what you've described in Africa?
Yeah, I think from my reading of the work that I've read of Carol's and Kevin Gallagher's and so on, it's different in that African countries are far lower income by and large. And so there's just a lot more poverty. And so a lot more, and the engagement has been a lot longer. The Chinese have been there since the late 50s. The first loan in Africa was in 1960, but that's not the case in Latin America. It's much more recent. So you don't have that sort of path dependence of those early Chinese companies coming in, those early Chinese relationships. So it is quite different, I think. And that's also why China Development Bank is kind of a lead actor there, whereas China Exim Bank, which does the foreign aid loans as well as preferential export buyers credits and so on, they're much bigger in Africa, not so big in Latin America.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. All right, so there are a few questions in here about some potential political implications of Chinese development activities in Africa. So Jay Mintzmeyer asked if you've witnessed or seen any other quality studies on this topic, if you've seen any potential correlation between economic aid investment or economic aid or investment and political outcomes, such as a UN vote alignment, vote policy changes, or military security arrangements. And is there any notable economic statecraft going on here, or has China's involvement been primarily development and business focused?
That's interesting. There is, you know, one of my students, David Landry, has been doing some really good research on this. So he's one of the people that's been publishing quite a bit. And he's got some working papers and also journal articles out. He doesn't have a book, and I don't know if he'll go in that route, but David Landry, Landry. But there's, you know, the research on China and UN voting, I think it's interesting, but you have to, it depends a lot on the quality of the data. So most of that research has been using data that is a little bit more problematic in terms of the early versions of the aid data at William and Mary. And I think that data had really some, there were a lot of false positives, for example, and it was really hard also to tell the year that an aid event actually happened, because there are lots of different possible years. And so it's really hard to link up aid transfers, for example, with UN voting. So I think that's, you know, the econometric work on that, they're making a good effort, but I'm a little skeptical of this. The second reason is that there are so many issues that come up for UN voting that are relevant to China as a developing country. So that these would also be ones that would be relevant to developing countries in Africa, for example. Things that have to do with how they see development, and that are not really, or things like, you know, votes about Israel or things like that are important to the US but are not important to African countries. So one has to look, there aren't that many times when you can actually research an issue that was important to China but wasn't really important to other countries in Africa, and then to try to analyze whether Chinese engagement helped with UN votes. So that's just to say that my understanding is that it would, because that's what the Chinese want. They are engaged in Africa. One of the big reasons is for those 54 votes. And it's not just the UN, it's also at the WTO. So it's things like Chinese status as a market economy as opposed to a state-controlled economy. So all those kinds of things, the Chinese, I wouldn't say they use this as a stick. It's much more a carrot, kind of like, we have this friendly relationship, this vote is coming up, or this decision is coming up, we would appreciate it if you support us, kind of thing. So, and I really see that as economic statecraft as well as just politics. So I see a lot of Chinese business engagement as it depends how you define economic statecraft. And I think that my definition might be slightly different from yours. But I do think that the way the Chinese approach us is not, these things are tangled together. So it's not purely business, it's not purely political. In many instances, there are aspects of both mixed together. But that said, there is a lot that is purely business. So and the interesting, like William Norris's work on this, I think is really good, because he did years and years of research on this Chinese economic statecraft to see how it works. So we really need to look at the cases where business doesn't explain it. And then that would be more where politics comes in. So I've written on this also in an article in International Affairs, if you're interested. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from W.R. Bain, and the question is, some have asserted that the PRC's continued BRI and infrastructure investments are in part to help prop up politically important Chinese state-owned enterprises and key private companies. How do you assess this argument?
Yeah. The Chinese finance, really what I've seen over the years that I've been looking at it, and this really goes back to the 1980s, there was no subterfuge about this. It's, you know, it's what they've been talking about, that the export credit agency, that's the whole purpose of an export credit agency, is, you know, to support the home country's firms. That's what ours does too. And so this is, whether these are loss leaders or subsidized, but it's getting them into the market. And then what we've seen, though, is that this has evolved so that these the finance helps them enter the market, but then it's much more what my colleague Kevin Gallagher says. It's a coordinated credit space. The companies are there, the credit is there, but then it evolves. And so Zambia is a really good example of this. So the Chinese would come in early on. Huawei got funding, other Chinese companies, whether state-owned or private or ostensibly private, their way was paved with these China Exim Bank loans. But it was, even from the beginning, there were other Chinese financiers in there just for their own profit, like Bank of China and CITIC. They've been there since the early 2000s, and they're not really carrying out, from what we can see, it's not like, you know, Beijing's commands to be there in Zambia. It's more because they saw this. There were already 250 Chinese companies there in the late 90s, and so they saw this is a place where, you know, there's a market for our services and we can thrive there. So propping up today, BRI, yeah, it's still helping. If you look at BRI, the projections into Europe, for example, this is still helping Chinese companies get into new markets. Africa's not a new market anymore. These are old markets, but extending the BRI in all around the world, where isn't the BRI anymore? I don't actually think the BRI is a very, very useful term. I hardly ever use it. But, you know, it's just about this current iteration of Chinese outward march. And it's about, in part, it's about propping them up, but also getting them into new markets. And then they're supposed to go on their own. So that's the interesting part. What happens? And in Zambia, we can see this happening. It's kind of a mess. But that's the worst case scenario, where you've got over 30 Chinese companies vying for contracts and 15 Chinese lenders, and they've created this this debt, what I call a debt tragedy of the commons. And I refer you to my forthcoming paper, which will be out very soon. But that's like the worst case scenario. And and then in other instances, there's been much more pullback. So it's not the same everywhere, but absolutely. It's to get market entry for these firms, and in new markets in particular.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze in possibly 2 or 3 more questions. So this next one comes from Anne Marie, and she wants to know your take on China's supply chain dominance in certain African countries. For example, the textile and shoe industry, which results in African companies not being able to compete with Chinese companies anymore.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. It's something that I read about in The Dragon's Gift, and I think we have to break this down into different eras of Chinese engagement. And really, in the first decade of this millennium, there was the Chinese were exporting to Africa, and they were exporting in the textile industries, and they were copying African patterns and reproducing them in China, and then exporting them again. And it was devastating. So even earlier than the first decade. And then pretty much what was going to, the textile industries that were going to fail, these African, often state-owned industries and others, they failed. And so that a lot of that was also due to other reasons, the debt crisis, earlier debt crisis, structural adjustment periods, lack of foreign exchange, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of reasons for that. And then what happened is that Chinese companies started getting interested in relocating to Africa. And so that's what a research project that we have with support from the UK government, from the Economic and Social Research Council. We spent really from 2014, I haven't talked about that research here, but from 2014 to 2019, looking into Chinese manufacturing investment in Africa. And interestingly, a lot of it is going into the textile sector. And Ethiopia is a place where you see this happening most successfully. And so what's happened in Ethiopia is that Chinese companies have relocated from China into Ethiopia, and they're now producing in Ethiopia. But what we found was that there was very little engagement with Ethiopian firms. So it's still like Ethiopians working in the factories, but Chinese running it, and they have all the managerial positions. So it wasn't a very sustainable case, at least not at this point. And a lot of that was due also to the Ethiopians not creating what the Chinese would say. The Chinese would like a nest for the phoenix to land in, but the African nests are not that great for the phoenix to land. So there's still like lots of problems, as we can see, like coups in Guinea and coups in Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia's conflict now. It's just it's so sad. But that's part of the problem. So that the African textile industries is part of the local value chain. The Chinese have, like in Ethiopia, they have been moving the African, like the leather that's produced in Ethiopia and the cotton that's produced there. They are coming to Ethiopia and they are investing in value added to those local products. So that's what we found in our research. And we also looked at similar things happening in Kenya and Tanzania and Nigeria. So it's interesting. And just a final point on that is that a lot of this is actually import substitution industrialization that the Chinese manufacturers are doing. They're coming to Africa and they're producing without the old like protective tariff barriers and all the bad things that happened last time with ISI. But this time they're trying to produce things where there's a good market locally instead of producing them in China, like cement, and exporting it to African countries. They're producing it there in Africa.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. All right, it looks like we have time for just one more question. So this question comes from M. Giles, and this hard-hitting question is, out of all of the data and research that you've looked at, in your opinion, what is China's end goal in Africa?
That's not Mohan, is it?
I'm not sure what the first name is for the questioner.
Yeah, so what is China's goal in Africa? China's goal in Africa is, I think the way I laid it out here, their goal in Africa is to do business in a politically sustainable way. So it's really, and then the political aspect of that is the diplomatic engagement. So they want to do very much what all the West and Japan have been doing through the years, which is to do business, and then they do want to make it sustainable. So they don't want to have to leave, because of scandals and irresponsible investor behavior. So we've seen so many examples in recent years of Chinese diplomats and ambassadors scolding their companies publicly and coming, being critical of the way, saying that they've got to follow these guidelines. But it's hard. It's also like a little bit, as we tend to think that, Beijing is controlling everything, that Xi Jinping stands there and is like operating all these pieces on the chessboard. But actually, it's much more like herding cats. It's a little bit like working with faculty at a university.
All right, well, thank you. Since we do have 2 more minutes, I will squeeze in one more question. Also, for everyone whose questions have not been answered, if you would like Dr. Brautigam to address those questions later on, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is npeterson@nsidteam.com, and I'd be happy to send those over to her. So this question comes from Kurt Regling from the office formerly known as SAF or SPI. And Kurt asks if any of your research has looked into the quality and sustainability of the infrastructure that China is building in these various sectors. There are various stories that the quality of their construction and services is not necessarily strong. And if true from your perspective, would this be an approach in which US industry could gain an advantage?
That's a great question. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the quality of Chinese construction is subpar. And I think it depends, it really depends on which case you're looking at. But by and large, Chinese quality is not at our level. And that's because, they're still like, what is their economy? It's sort of like at the level of Lithuania or something. They're not at the US level. There's the size of the economy, but not the quality of their development yet by any means. And so that's why they're also really competitive, because it is lower quality. And so it doesn't cost as much. So US firms are really not in that same sector. You know, the quality of our construction is just so high. The cost of our engineers is so high compared to the Chinese that we're just going to cost a whole lot more than they are for an equivalent project. So we shouldn't be competing. Where we do have, I think, a comparative advantage is where the same thing that German companies and Italian companies and French companies are doing, Belgian companies, Swedish, they're doing the quality control aspects. So like things like being the supervising engineer on projects. And so that, you know, this is a huge issue, and I wish I could address it more fully. That's one of the things I'm writing about now. But that, I think, is where US firms could come in. And we've published something earlier this year on how the Chinese and French firms are working together on this kind of thing, totally as business relationships, because the quality control, the French have that down. They really have good quality engineers, and the Chinese are doing the construction work and more of the grunt work. So it's a good teamwork. And if we didn't have, I think, such politically fraught relations now, there would be a lot more of that between Chinese and American companies.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Brautigam. And thank you to everyone that's attended today's brief. Really great questions, and we had a lot that we didn't address today. So thank you all for contributing here, and feel free to shoot me an email. Mariah posted my email in the chat if you would like me to pass along your remaining questions to Dr. Brautigam. But thank you again, and thank you so much, Dr. Brautigam, for such a great brief.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.